All right, so welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be uncovering the life of Abdullah ibn Salam, a prominent figure from early Islamic history. And what's really fascinating about this guy is that before he embraced Islam, he was actually the chief rabbi of Medina. Talk about a life-changing decision, huh?
It definitely is, yeah. And to really understand the magnitude of that, we need to understand the context a little bit. So Medina at that time was a very diverse place. Different cultures, religions, all coming together. And Jewish tribes actually had a lot of influence there. Abdullah himself is a descendant of Joseph and was super respected within that community.
Wow, so we're talking about someone at the very top of his game, religiously speaking, revered for his knowledge and piety. The lecture we're looking at by Dr. Omar Suleiman actually paints a picture of Abdullah's daily routine. And it was incredibly disciplined. Like, he divided his day into three parts: teaching at the synagogue, then private study and worship, and then tending to his date palms and trade. It's almost like you can see these seeds of his future conversion, in this dedication to truth and community. Values that really resonated with the prophet's message.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great observation. I mean, this balance that he maintained between his scholarship, his spiritual practice, and then actually, being a part of the community really says a lot about him. It challenges, that stereotype of a religious leader being kind of detached from everyday life.
Right, exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. So, Abdullah was obviously devout in his Jewish faith, right? But he was also really intrigued by these verses in the Torah that prophesied the coming of another prophet. He even prayed that he would live long enough to see this event. Do we know anything about how Abdullah himself felt about those prophecies? Like, what drew him to them so strongly?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say exactly what his emotions were, like specific emotions aren't really detailed in the sources we have. But it's clear that these verses really sparked something in him. It was like he recognized that even within his own faith, there was still something more to come,
Yeah.
like a truth that hadn't been fully revealed yet.
Wow, that's powerful. So then word starts spreading to Medina about this man in Mecca claiming to be a prophet. And Abdullah, always the scholar, right? He starts researching like crazy, collecting information, comparing everything he's learning to the scriptures he knew so well. And the more he uncovers, the more everything just lines up perfectly with the prophecies he'd been thinking about for years. It's almost as if his whole life was leading up to this moment, right?
Exactly. He's like a detective,
Yeah.
piecing together all these clues, examining every little detail with such precision. And as the pieces fall into place, his conviction grows stronger and stronger. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, this could really be the prophet he's been waiting for.
And this is where we see a real turning point for Abdullah. When Prophet Muhammad finally migrates to Medina after months of anticipation, Abdullah climbs a palm tree to get the best view. And the lecture describes all this excitement, the crowds, the shouts, the Prophet has arrived. And there he is, high above it all, shouting, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. His aunt, Khalida, is with him, and she's totally confused by his reaction. I mean, from her perspective, this is just another event. She doesn't understand the deeper meaning for Abdullah.
Yeah, they're seeing the same thing, but through totally different lenses.
Yeah.
Khalid is looking at it through the lens of tribal dynamics and social shifts,
Yeah.
while Abdullah is seeing the fulfillment of prophecy, like a divine plan unfolding right in front of them.
And his response to his aunt is just amazing. He tells her, "Oh, my aunt, I swear by Allah that he is the brother of Moses. He is on the religion of Moses, and he was sent with what he was sent with." It's like he instantly recognizes the prophet's connection to this whole lineage of prophets he's been studying. Like he sees the continuity of revelation through history.
It's a moment of pure realization. Everything he's been searching for, it all just clicks into place. He sees that thread that connects Moses to this new prophet, the thread of divine guidance.
And driven by that conviction, Abdullah pushes through the crowds to see the prophet for himself. And when he finally sees him, he declares, "That's not the face of a liar." I mean, it seems like such a simple statement, but it really shows how perceptive Abdullah was. Like, his ability to judge character was honed by years of spiritual study and reflection. He's seeing beyond just the physical. He's sensing this inherent truthfulness in the prophet.
Yeah, it's fascinating how he comes to that judgment even before hearing the prophet speak. It really speaks to his intuition, his ability to see the essence of a person. And that's also associated with a very deep spiritual understanding.
And then he witnesses the prophet's first khutbah, the Friday sermon in Medina. And the core messages are all about peace, community, and spiritual devotion. Themes that must have really resonated with Abdullah, given everything he believed in.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Okay.
like all the pieces of the puzzle are finally coming together.
Mm.
He's seen the prophet arrive, he's sensed his authenticity, and now he's hearing a message that aligns perfectly with his understanding of truth and what's right.
And then we get to this pivotal moment. The prophet asks Abdullah his name, and when he hears it, Al-Hussein ibn Salam, he says, "You are Abdullah," which means servant of Allah. This new name really becomes like a symbol of his transformation, like shedding his old identity to fully embrace his new path as a Muslim. I wonder if, like, choosing a name with such a clear meaning was common back then.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we have a ton of information on like the specifics of name changes during conversions, but it does show that the prophet recognized Abdullah's sincere devotion, right? Like the new name reflects this idea of submitting to one God, which is obviously a core principle of Islam.
It's powerful stuff. And just when you think the story can't get any more intense, Abdullah proposes this test of faith. Like, he asks the prophet to call the Jewish community together and ask about him before revealing his conversion. He predicts that they'll deny his Islam out of fear and prejudice. It's such a bold move. It shows so much trust in the prophet and this willingness to face the potential consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Can you imagine like the pressure of that moment, putting your newfound faith and your whole reputation on the line like that? It speaks volumes about how strong his conviction was, his unwavering belief in the truth he had found.
Yeah, it's incredible. And just as Abdullah predicted when the prophet asks about him, the Jewish community is full of praise. They call him their leader, the most knowledgeable among them. But then, as soon as the prophet reveals Abdullah's conversion, everything changes. Their admiration turns into denial. They just refuse to accept that their esteemed rabbi has chosen a different path. It's heartbreaking, especially because it mirrors the rejection the prophet himself faced from his own tribe.
It's a sad reminder that prejudice can be so deep-rooted, even among people who, claim to follow the scriptures. Abdullah's experience shows the challenges that so many converts face, that pain of being ostracized by the people you were once closest to. It's a huge sacrifice to make for your beliefs.
It really is. And Abdullah's story doesn't end there. In fact, some scholars believe that it's actually woven into the Quran itself. Verses like, "Have you considered that what if this is from Allah and you have disbelieved in it, and a witness from Bani Israel has testified to it and believed while you turned away from it in arrogance?" Seem to directly reference his conversion. It's like his story becomes a testament to the universal appeal of Islam. It shows that this faith resonates with people from all different backgrounds. What's really cool here is that his story isn't just like a historical footnote, it's embedded in the very text of the Quran.
Exactly. It shows how important his conversion was. His journey from Judaism to Islam is this powerful example of how truth can go beyond any cultural or religious boundaries.
Right. And his life after converting to Islam is just as fascinating. He totally immersed himself in his new faith. He became just as devoted to the Quran as he had been to the Torah. Studying, teaching, sharing his knowledge, it became his whole life. He brought this amazing scholarly rigor and spiritual depth to the Muslim community, and he became a respected figure among the Prophet's companions. And get this, his two sons, Yusuf and Muhammad, who were born after his conversion, they both went on to become scholars of Islam too. It makes you think about how a parent's dedication to learning and faith can really impact their kids.
For sure. It's a great example of how the things that parents value and are passionate about can shape the next generation. Abdullah's son saw how committed he was to knowledge and how deeply connected he was to his faith, and he chose to follow in his footsteps. It really says something about the legacy he built, not just through his scholarship, but through his example as a father.
That's so true. And there's this wonderful story about a man who enters the masjid, and some companions remark that he's destined for paradise just by looking at him. And it turns out that this man had been really moved by Abdullah's dream. The one about the garden and the metal pole reaching up to heaven with a handhold at the top. He actually sought Abdullah out for guidance. He was so inspired by this dream, by this idea of finding that handhold of faith. This dream, by the way, the prophet interpreted it as meaning that Abdullah would remain strong in his faith and would have a place in paradise. It clearly resonated with others who were trying to find their own path. Do we know how common it was for people to, base their decisions on dreams back then?
Well, we don't have exact numbers, but it's clear that dreams were super important to people back then. They saw them as symbolic and spiritual, like messages from a higher power, maybe. It was a time when people were much more connected to their spiritual side.
That's interesting. It's like a reminder that Looking for that handhold in our own spiritual journey is a universal thing, something that people have always struggled with. And Abdullah's story shows that those handholds can come from unexpected places. But he wasn't just a scholar and a dreamer, you know. He was also a very practical advisor, especially for people who were new to Medina. The lecture talks about how he would warn them about the dangers of riba, which is like the exploitative practice of usury. He urged them to stay away from even the more subtle forms of it in their business dealings. It shows how concerned he was with ethical behavior. Like, he wanted to make sure that people's everyday actions were in line with Islamic principles.
Yeah, his advice shows that he understood how faith translates into action. He wasn't just interested in teaching concepts. He wanted to help people live a righteous life, even in the middle of all the complexities of trade and business. For him, ethics were an essential part of faith.
Right. But even in this time of relative peace and growth, Abdullah saw trouble brewing. During the Fitna, which was this period of intense civil strife after the Prophet's death, he witnessed all this tension and extremism that was threatening to tear the Muslim community apart.
It must have been devastating for him, to see the unity that had been built during the Prophet's time start to fall apart. And yet, even in the face of all that turmoil, his wisdom and foresight really shine through.
He was actually the last person to try and reason with the group that ended up assassinating Uthman, the third caliph. He pleaded with them, urging them not to unleash the sword of Allah upon themselves. He warned them that if they did, it wouldn't be sheathed until the day of judgment.
Those words are so powerful, almost chilling, right? Especially since they foreshadow the chaos that followed. They show how deeply he understood history, the cyclical nature of violence, and the terrible consequences of bloodshed.
It's like he could see the potential for everything to spiral out of control. His words were a desperate attempt to bring peace and reason, a last-ditch effort to stop the tragedy. But sadly, his warnings were ignored. Uthman was assassinated, and just as Abdullah predicted, things got really bad. Yeah, it's just tragic how his warnings went unheeded. It really shows, how those decisions, those moments in history can have such huge ripple effects. And his wisdom is evident again in his interactions with Ali, the fourth caliph. So as Ali is getting ready to leave Medina to confront these forces that are opposing him, Abdullah urges him to stay. And he's drawing on his deep understanding of history and human nature here. He warns Ali that if he leaves Medina, the memory of the prophet and all his teachings will start to fade. And knowing what we know about Ali's eventual assassination in Kufa, it's hard not to see this as like a prophetic insight, right?
Yeah, such a powerful moment and full of foreshadowing, right? Abdullah seems to understand that Medina has this symbolic importance, like it's connected to the Prophet's legacy. And he knows that being away from Medina physically and in people's minds could really weaken that connection. It makes you think about how important it is to protect the teachings of those who came before us, especially during times of conflict and uncertainty. Those guiding principles that can lead us towards unity.
Absolutely. And as all this turmoil is escalating, Abdullah chooses to withdraw from the fitna. He realized that he couldn't stop this tragedy that was unfolding, but he could focus on what he did best, teaching and narrating hadith. He wanted to make sure that the Prophet's words were preserved and that his message continued to resonate, for generations to come. What strikes me is his resilience, his dedication to knowledge, even in the middle of all this upheaval. It's like he's setting an example of choosing peace and understanding, even when everything around him is chaotic.
Yeah, for sure. He shows how much he believed in the power of knowledge. He knew that preserving the Prophet's words, those teachings of compassion and unity, was so important, especially when things were so divided.
Exactly. And eventually, after this long and really impactful life, Abdullah ibn Salam passed away at an old age. He left behind an incredible legacy of scholarship, piety, and faith. He was buried in al-Baqi alongside the Prophet's family and companions. It's a fitting tribute to someone who dedicated his life to Islam.
It's amazing to think how his journey started, right? He was this respected leader in one faith, and then he found his truth in another.
Yeah, his story is a powerful reminder that the search for truth can take you down unexpected paths. And embracing that truth, even when it challenges what society expects or requires sacrifice, it can transform your life. And not just your life, but the lives of others too. Abdullah ibn Salam, the former chief rabbi who became this pillar of Islam, he really embodies that power, the power of faith and conviction. It's inspiring, isn't it? The way he handled all those complexities with integrity and grace. What really stands out to me is his commitment to knowledge. Whether he was studying the Torah or the Quran, he was driven by this thirst for understanding. And I think that's something we can all learn from, this constant pursuit of knowledge, this openness to growth and change.
Oh, absolutely. Abdul Salam's story shows us that learning is a lifelong journey, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries we make about ourselves and the world come from those unexpected paths. His story is such an important part of Islamic history. It really shows that truth can resonate across different cultures and faiths.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of Abdullah bin Salam, what sticks with you the most? What parts of his journey make you curious? Or inspire you in your own search for knowledge and meaning? Think about it. Maybe, just like Abdullah, you'll find yourself drawn to unexpected discoveries guided by that human desire to understand ourselves and the world around us. Thanks for joining us, everyone.